Australia at the dawn of the 1950s was indeed a lucky country. It was a self-sufficient country with negligible unemployment, spiralling wool prices, booming factory output, and the universal dream of home ownership was fast becoming a reality.
As we came to terms with greater and greater affluence, there was an extraordinary range of sporting pursuits and pastimes in Australia 1950s. And in a cricketing context, the thing that defines the 1950s is the absence of Bradman.
Bradman had gone, and we knew there was going to be a downturn in crowds. And with the Holden car arriving around about the same time, people were going to be doing other things.
Although the 1950s was an economic boom time for Australia, this was not the case for cricketers. It was a time when sports were considered to be a pastime rather than a profession. Yet Australia undertook an unprecedented 8 overseas tours during the decade, at a time when players also had to hold down a full-time job in order to support a family.
It was tough. If you've got a family, to remit money home, which you have to save while you're on tour, remit it home so you could feed your wife, and if you had any kids, we could do that.
For the first time, Australia would play matches in every corner of the known cricket world. New markets emerged. Davidson, Sobers and Truman would soon become household names as cricket strove to maintain its popularity as the king of summer games in Australia.
Pulling into Durban ahead of time on a very dull, wet morning, the Nestor brings the Australian cricket team to South Africa. Central figure, as he will be throughout the tour, was their captain Lindsay Hassett.
The first Australian captain post-Bradman was Lindsay Hassett, who led Australia on a 6-month tour of South Africa during the summer of 1949-50. Although Hassett had captained the Australian Services team at the end of the war and had been a faithful deputy to Don Bradman, his appointment was no certainty.
The things that were held against Hassett were the fact that he was an irreverent, rather anti-establishment figure, and is that he was Catholic. And Australia hadn't had a Catholic captain since Warwick Armstrong in 1921, and before that Percy MacDonald in the 1880s. And there was still vestiges of the sectarian divide in Australian society.
Hassett only secured the Australian captaincy by a margin of 1 vote over Arthur Morris.
I was very fond of Lindsay Hassett, and I appreciated what he'd done for Australian cricket. He was such a great cricketer. I would never ever... In fact, I would never have gone to South Africa if they'd have turned out that I would have been Captain Lindsay Hassett, vice captain.
Springbok captain Dudley North spins the coin. Lindsay Hassett calls correctly.
Australia, under Hassett's leadership, went through this tour of South Africa undefeated. However, the third test in Durban turned out to be the Great Escape.
We got caught on a sticky wicket. Now, Durban climate is very much like the Brisbane climate. You get those heavy thunderstorms, and then the sun comes out and bakes the top of the wicket, and underneath is mud. And it makes batting a little bit difficult.
After South Africa had scored 311, Australia were routed for a paltry 75 runs. South African off-spinner Hugh Tayfield took 7 wickets for 23. With more thunderstorms predicted for later in the match, South African captain Dudley North decided not to enforce the follow-on.
So Dudley North thought, well, I'm going to bat again and catch these blokes on another sticky in a day or so's time. But unfortunately, the storm didn't come.
The only storm came from the Australian bowlers, who dismissed South Africa in their second innings for only 99, leaving Australia to score 336 to win the match. At one stage, Australia was struggling at 3 for 59.
This brought Neil Harvey to try and retrieve Australia's failing prospects. Ably supported by Sam Loxton, 21-year-old Neil Harvey played one of the finest innings that has ever been played. By the time he reached his century, certain defeat had been averted and Australia had a chance of winning. Inexorably, Australia knocked off the necessary runs to win by 5 wickets. It was Neil Harvey who scored the winning run to give Australia the rubber, and even the umpire fought for a souvenir of a great performance.
I think this would probably go down as probably the best innings, in my opinion anyway, that I ever played in Test cricket. It took me about 5.5 hours to make 151 not out, but it was contrary to the way I normally played the game, because I like to get on with it. I used to like to play a few shots and whatever. But on this particular pitch, you couldn't do it. It was a matter of survival, picking up the runs when you could against 2 fine spin bowlers.
In the summer of 1950-51, England arrived in Australia for the first post-Bradman Ashes series.
Well, I thought we picked a bad side. We left behind experienced batsmen, and I think we made a big mistake then. We took a lot of experienced young players.
Even though Bradman was gone, the crowds flocked to see stars like Keith Miller and Ray Lindell doing battle with the old enemy. Australia won the series 4-1. However, some of the matches were close. When England won the 5th Test in Melbourne, it was their victory over Australia since 1938.
They were wonderful Test matches to watch, and of course they were all untrammelled by the commercialism that we know today. You could see who was playing. Bareheaded Neil Harvey, bareheaded Keith Miller, the dashing Keith Miller. He was out there.
It'd be probably fair to say that most people who were interested in cricket at that stage, and probably a few weren't that interested in cricket, were all Miller fans. So going to the Adelaide Oval, I'd sit down with Dad and he'd just say to me, look what Miller does, watch what Miller's doing.
And just look what Miller did with the first 3 balls of a day's play during the 4th Test in Adelaide.
First ball, Miller comes back and the covers now. Watford, Hutton is chasing it. The pass is Brook. It goes out for 4. Betzer again to Miller. Miller cracks the next one. It's through again. Another 4. Now a very deep field as Hutton is left down deep in cover. As Betzer below Miller. Short. This one's short and he goes through. And I think it's another 4. Park Brook. It's 4 again.
Oh, I remember him hitting for 3/4 there, first 3 balls of the day. I just probably bowled about 30 overs the day before, so I was a bit stiff, I suppose.
One thing that sticks in my mind, 50-51 with Miller, what a great athlete he was, because he was running and he slid his bat and the bat jammed into the turf. And, I mean, he would have skewered himself, except that he was such a great athlete, he just hurtled over the bat.
At the Sydney Ground, Australia and the West Indies met in the 2nd Test.
The following year saw the Australian authorities take a significant step forward in terms of broadening its cricketing horizons.
The game was becoming a little more internationalised in that in 51-2, John Goddard's multiracial West India visited Australia, and it was quite a series. There were some thrilling finishes.
The West Indies side had stars, like the spin twins Ramadin and Valentine, and the 3 Ws, Worrell, Weekes and Walcott.
Lindwall and Miller were the 2 bowlers who we were concerned about more than any other. I think we handled them pretty well. My style of batting, I found Lindwall the more difficult because of the wrong arm type of bowling.
When we did go to Australia in 51, 52, it was on radio. Even though it was shortwave and the crackly sounds coming into the middle of the night, I think that added to the whole mystique of it, that West Indies in Australia. People here wondered how we could actually play cricket in the middle of the night. No wonder Miller and Lindwall were that quick. They couldn't see it.
We were not all that good as a combination, where individuals played well, but as a team, I don't think we were all that brilliant.
They were a very good side, but I don't think they knew how to win at that stage. And in one test in Melbourne, Bill Johnston and Doug Ring got the runs to win the game.
In the Melbourne Test match, the West Indies were on the verge of an historic victory. when Australia's last wicket pair, Ring and Johnston, managed to score the required 38 runs in a heart-stopping finish.
Of course, Doug and Bill had wonderful senses of humour, and they were laughing their head off the whole time, winning the game for us.
The following summer, 1952-53, against South Africa, saw the emergence of a number of young players who would have a profound impact on Australian cricket over the next decade. Colin McDonald, an opening bat from Victoria, Alan Davidson, a left-handed all-rounder from New South Wales, and Richie Benaud, a hard-hitting batsman and leg-spin bowler, also from New South Wales.
The three selectors were Bill Brown, Jack Ryder and Phil Ridings, who was captain of the South Australian side. I can remember in the Australian 11 game against South Africa at the SCG, I made some runs in the first innings and got some in the second and holed out of Percy Mansell right out on the boundary. It was going for 6 and someone caught it. In the dressing room, Phil said, "Son, don't do that, because selectors like myself, we've got to justify you being in the side, and we'd much rather you make 50 than 39 and be caught on the boundary."
However, the real sensation of the summer was 17-year-old Ian Craig, who starred for New South Wales in the match against South Africa.
I was 100 not out on the end of the first night, and the following morning, Sid Barnes, whom I was batting with at the time, as we walked out, he said, "Well, look, if you get 100, you've got 100 and that's nice, but if you get 200, we'll remember you and you'll probably get a tour to England."
Craig scored 213 not out and became the youngest player to wear the baggy green cap when he was selected to play in the 5th Test in Melbourne. He impressed with scores of 53 and 47 and secured his place on the England tour.
Just walking out was, huge, because I'd never played in front of a crowd. It started off at probably 25,000, 30,000 and built to nearly 50. So there was that excitement in the crowd, the chatter and everything that was going on, and you felt that when you were out there.
This was a time before travelling by air was commonplace. So in 1953, the players enjoyed a leisurely 4-week journey by ship to England.
The boy from Parramatta had never been on a ship in his life before, hadn't even been on a rowboat in the Parramatta River, and then get on this big ship, the Orchids, that was going to take us for 4 weeks to England. Black tie, second sitting captain's table every day for all meals, and just brilliant. And never even thought that I might be doing that. Neil Harvey and I roomed together on the boat, and at 4 o'clock he woke me up and said, "Come on, we're going to go and watch this boat dock." We're into Tilbury, we were there rather than Southampton. We watched it come in. It was the most impressive thing.
The opening match of the England tour was played at the picturesque ground at Worcester. Here, a young Ian Craig and Richie Benaud watched their first cricket match played under English conditions.
For the young guys, most of us were non-drinkers, and we'd sort of do these bus trip game, having finished one game at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, have to go on to the next place to start the following morning.
The older guys had mostly been to the war. They had that comradeship amongst them, and they drank a fair bit.
These chaps who had been through a war period enjoyed the companionship that comes from that sort of environment. We'd love to hop off in a pub and have a beer and talk to the locals. It wasn't much fun for us, so left out in the bus, contemplating when we were going to get to bed.
1953 was also the coronation year of Queen Elizabeth II. Here, Prince Robert Menzies chats with Richie Benaud and Neil Harvey. On the day of the coronation, the Australian players were given the opportunity to view the procession from close range.
We felt it was a great honour to be invited to see at close range the coronation. There was another factor. The war hadn't been over very long. Australia was very close to Great Britain, economically and politically.
The test matches provided some nail-biting finishes. At Lord's on the final day, England, when Willie Watson and Trevor Bailey mounted a rearguard action.
Miller kept up his hostile attack, but just as Watson withstood it at one end, so did Bailey at the other. Bailey went on stoutly to pass his 50. Next, Watson reached his century. And at 109, he was out. Would England be able to keep it up till 6:30? Watson, anyway, what ovation he received. Then Bailey went, and English spectators felt more anxious than ever, but well played Bailey.
Bailey said to himself, this can be done. We can do this. We can save this match. Of course, Watson couldn't have done it without Bailey. Bailey couldn't have done it without Willie at the other end, but we were disappointed.
Finished crowd at Leeds for a total of 205, left England 107 to win and 115 minutes in which to get the runs. Hassett and his men went for the runs at once. Hit made a quick 38. Harvey, too, was in fine form, and there was plenty of fast work between the wickets.
We played by the clock, perspective of the spot.
I said to Len, do you want to save this? Because I'll stop them. And I bowled leg theory, which I bowled before.
He started bowling round the wicket to me, bowling wide out on the crease as he possibly could, and the ball was almost hitting the square leg umpire, though, going diagonally across the pitch, and I just couldn't reach him.
When the last ball was bowled, Australia were 30 runs short of victory.
We only needed 30 to win, and if they had the amount of overs to bowl like they should have had, as by today's rulings, we'd have got the runs quite comfortably, and we'd have won that, and we'd have gone to the Oval one up instead of being square.
After the first 4 tests had each ended in a draw, the fate of the Ashes came down to the last day of the last test at the Oval. The BBC cancelled all its scheduled programming to give extended coverage to the cricket.
And 4 runs needed. Now, will this be got in one stroke, or 4 runs to get? No, is it the Ashes? Yes, England have won the Ashes.
For the first time in 20 years, England had regained the Ashes.
The crowd just erupted, and I mean, almost 3/4 of the ground was covered in people, because it hadn't happened since 32, 33, and it was a great step up. And I think it gave England a terrific lift.
Everyone in England had celebrated. Well, everyone except one.
I came off the field, we'd beat Australia, and I had 2 telegrams. One to say that my favourite grandma had died the night before. We won the Ashes, which, of course, had upset me. I opened the second message, and that was from RAF Hemswell. I was still in the Royal Air Force, don't forget. Didn't say congratulations or anything. It just said, notice, test match finish, expected back 23:59 hours.
When England toured Australia in 1954-55, 3 bowlers who had helped bowl England to that historic 1953 Ashes victory, Jim Laker, Locke and Truman, were not selected.
I was shattered. I couldn't believe the season I'd had. I was the only fast bowler in England with 100 wickets that year. They took Frank Tyson. I think he might have got 60-odd wickets, although Frank was quick. He's the quickest bowler I ever saw.
Frank Tyson turned out to be the fastest bowler most of the Australian bats too. The man they called Typhoon Tyson ripped the heart out of the Australian batting lineup.
Certainly the fastest I've ever seen in all the time. Only perhaps by a millimetre from Jeff Thompson, but Tyson was the fastest. And there were 2 dicey pitches in that series. The first one was in Sydney, where they won. That was a green top where you couldn't distinguish the pitch from the rest of the square.
The ball started to jag around.
You've got to remember, that batted without helmets. We batted without arm guards. We batted without anything except a pair of pads, a box, and maybe a thigh pad. And that's all we had.
I bowled to Jimmy Burke, and I went down the wicket and I bowled him a bouncer, and he said to me, if you bowl another bouncer at me, I'll get you over the head with this bat. So I bowled him, guess what? Another bouncer.
I had to be quick to make sure that she was behind the ball, or else it was all up. And you heard that I said the bat, not the...
The Melbourne Test match is best remembered for what became the watered pitch fiasco.
Bill Verhoff, who was curator, had been given the assistance of a curator from the Albert Ground called Jack House. And through the test of breaking up.
We played on the Saturday, and by the end of the day, there were cracks sort of half an inch wide in the middle of the pitch and, over the whole of the pitch.
There were pieces of turf on the wicket that had cracks you could put your fingers down. And the Sunday came. There was no play on Sundays in those days.
4 in Melbourne on the Sunday. We got back to start play on Monday morning, and any cracks there. The pitch had been watered.
Now, Jack, being a district curator, he solved the problem very easily in the pitch, giving it a bit of water by slaking its thirst. And that apparently what he did, which of course you can't do in the middle of a test match.
Which was, of course, against the rules. So we watered the pitch. It worked in England's favour. The pitch had been watered for morning, and it's back to its normal state.
And they batted on 2 perfect wickets, and we batted on 2 that had cracks wide.
By the time we batted, the pitch had gone again. The cracks had appeared, and they were turning up at the edges, and it became a nightmare to bat on. Frank Tyson bowling these thunderbolts. Some were going past your nose, and some were hitting on the ankle.
Australia was set 240 to win the Test match and was well placed at 2 for 75 at the end of the 4th day's play. Needing to score 165 runs on the final day, Australia lost its last 8 wickets for just 30 runs. Typhoon Tyson taking 7 wickets for 27.
All you people who went down to Melbourne on that particular occasion expecting to see an easy Australian victory all went down with your sandwiches neatly cut and your thermoses, and you went down and they used to say to me, "You bastard, Tyson, you bowled them all out and we had to eat our lunch in the Fitzroy Gardens." And 60,000 meat pies went to waste.
England triumphed in the series 3-1. It was the first time in over 25 years that England had won consecutive Ashes series. It was a disappointing result for new skipper Ian Johnson, who had taken over the Australian captaincy following the retirement of Lindsay Hassett.
Ian Johnson was the establishment's choice from the start. They probably always had him in mind as the next man when the vacancy occurred. Anything but Keith Miller seemed to be the feeling.
Miller was a Melbourne High boy. Miller came from not so much the wrong side of the tracks, but he didn't come from the right side. He was a player who'd college boy, very well spoken.
Captains in those days were chosen, I won't say primarily, but certainly it was a big factor, chosen on their ability to make after-dinner speeches. Miller was a mentor to me, and I just thought he was a terrific guy, as well as a wonderful cricketer, but he wasn't a speechmaker. There's no question about that, whereas Jono was a speechmaker.
In 1955, Australia embarked on an historic tour of the West Indies. This was the first official visit by an Australian side to the Caribbean.
The moves to undertake those tours to new frontiers is really behind those, in a lot of ways, I think, is Robert Menzies. Menzies came away from the Commonwealth Heads of Government Conference in 1953 with a request from the Jamaican government to facilitate a tour because their approaches to the Australian Board of Control had been successful. There are letters in the Menzies papers from Menzies to Bill Jeans, the Secretary of the Board, saying, "I think this would be a very good idea." Hint, hint. And lo and behold, within 2 years, you do have an Australian tour to the West Indies.
We were regarded as one of the finest ambassadorial sides ever to appear in the West Indies, and it was a contrast. We started with from the tarmac after the plane landed, and Jono making a speech, and Miller was king. Everyone wanted to talk to Miller.
Miller, Lindwall, Morris, MacDonald, Harvey, all those names were well known before they came to the West Indies. They'd played against the West Indies, most of them, in 51, 52. This time, West Indians had got the opportunity to actually see Australians live. I think they felt when the Australians came here that they would come here, all of them 7 or 8 feet tall with about 4 or 5 hands, and each could deliver a ball fast as the other. They had a mystique about them, the Australians.
We arrived and there was all these placards at the airport and people having a go, white Australia policy, go home, and all this sort of stuff. And following what England had copped the year before, we knew that it was going to be pretty tough. And I must say that what Ian Johnson and Miller did and what they achieved was an absolutely fantastic thing for Australia, not just on the cricket scene there, but what it did for relationships between the two countries or the two areas.
Australians are very easygoing, and we got on very, very well with the locals. It was very important after the White Australia policy, you know, Australia being known around the world as a purely white predominant society. So we went out of our way and we had a wonderful time, and Ian did a great job, not only on the field but off the field.
Australia, having lost the Ashes to England, visit the West Indies and in their first test win by 9 wickets. The home team took the field first and was soon in trouble as Arthur Morris set about the bowling. In the first innings, he made 65 before falling to Valentine. Another first innings victim for Valentine McDonald, but not before he'd added 50 valuable runs to the Aussie score.
We won 3-0 against, the likes of Weeks, Worrell, Walcott, Ramadan, Valentine. Pretty good players. Clyde Walcott made 800 runs in the series, and I think Weeks and Worrell both got over 400 runs.
When the Australians came here in '55, they brought a refreshing side to professionalism, and the teams really well. And it was a very exciting series. Australia won it easily, but yet there were some outstanding performances by the West Indies, and a few new West Indian players came through, with Gary Sobers especially.
I remember opening the innings. Jeffrey Stallmer had injured himself, and I was a kind of a sacrifice. And they sent me in to open the innings with J.K. Holt.
I recall his, fascinating innings of 43 in Barbados against Miller Lingwall, and we knew he was, a superstar in action.
He hit 10 fours, and he absolutely drove Miller and Lingwall straight through the covers for fours. He square cut them for fours, and it was all over in half an hour.
I remember after I'd taken about 4 fours off Keith in the first over, and K. Holt had played a maiden at the other end. And then Keith came on again. I think I took another 4 fours off of him.
I went and got my box out of the dressing room and wore it. It's the only time I've box and fielded a gully, because I used to field closer than normal. The ball still kept on going past me. At least I had something protected. And if I'd had a helmet in those days, I'd have probably worn that as well.
When Ray Kay was standing at the non-strikers end, he looked at me and he said to me, Sonny, you're doing very well, but you stay at this end.
Arriving at Tilbury, the Himalaya brought over the Australian Test cricketers, 17 of the best and all in fighting form. Keith Miller is vice-captain, but many of the newcomers. Len Hutton, reporting the Tests this year, was there to meet skipper Ian Johnson and his men.
We're a very confident side, we're a very happy side, and I can assure you that you're going to see some jolly fine cricket from us.
I think there was still a feeling that perhaps Miller might have got the job in 1956. When he didn't, the same old thing went on. We went over there, the captain and the vice-captain didn't like each other, but the rest of us, it didn't affect the rest of us. We got on with it.
England's supporters were fairly optimistic on the fourth day. It was Australia's premier, Mr Menzies. Benno and Mackay now went out to resume the Aussies' second knock, and few could have expected such a Benno innings. He went for the bowling and even hit Truman for 6. His 97 put an entirely new complexion on the match. Truman got him eventually, caught Evans. On the last day, England started with 8 wickets in hand and 300 to make. Keith Miller was again bowling real fizzes.
With Ray Lindwall out injured, Keith rose to the occasion and took 10 wickets in the match.
Truman was clean bowled by Archer, and it was 1-up in the series to Australia. Without a doubt, they deserved this victory, and they had every reason to be jubilant.
And I can still see or hear Peter to me after the game finished, after we beat them at Lord's. He said, Neil, that's the last wicket you're going to get like that. And boy, was he right.
It was after that game that Frank Tyson was told he was out injured at the time, but recovering well, and for the third test at Headingley. And he was sent a message, don't bother getting yourself fit, you won't be needed for the rest of the tour.
The real damage was done by Laker at one end and the other half of the famous combination Lock at the other.
The Leeds pitch had been for spin. It was out of character. Instead of the normal Leeds pitch, which was a darkish grey, this one was a bright yellow.
Which fell like ninepins. Here's one of them, Maddox, nicely taken by Truman off Lock. The last 2 wickets added nothing and followed on. The question now was, could Laker and Lock do it again?
We had wickets that were doctored for Laker and Lock. I have no hesitation in saying that.
Harvey was the chief obstacle in this innings, making a very fine 69. Laker, however, took 6 for 50, being one of the tins. Lock to Archer, and he's caught by Washbrook. Laker to Mackay, and he bowls him. England wins by an innings and 42. What a triumph for Peter May and his team. Before Australia at Leeds.
And we got up to Old Trafford, and the groundsman up there prepared this sand heap, treated with a substance called marl, and we looked at it and said, God, this is a 2.5 day wicket, this. And as it turned out, it was.
I had film of the blokes actually sweeping the pitch, and you could not see the people sweeping because of the dust.
The pitch in Manchester was like Bondi Day, and we had a bat on it.
First to go is Colin McDonald. He's waiting, and Emrys Davis has given him out. Yes, I thought he must be out.
There's been one famous ball bowled, supposedly the ball that Warne bowled Gatting with. Everybody still talks about it, and I think it was batting for 5 years after that. But I can vouch for you that that I got one just as good in 1956 from Laker.
Harvey is clean bowled by Laker. Ooh. Yes, if only was done.
And I thought, I've got the...
Laker. Yes, he's on LBW.
Jim Laker was the greatest off-spinner I reckon I've ever seen. He was wonderful to have on your side. He was very difficult to bat against. He got the control, he spun the ball. He was an artist.
I think he was the complete off-spinner. He had the most beautiful action of an off-spinner. He bowled side on. He got his right arm, his delivery arm was very high, and he came right over the top.
After taking 9 wickets in Australia's first innings, Laker went one better in the second innings, taking all 10. Jim Laker's match figures of 19 wickets for 90 remains the greatest single bowling performance in Test cricket.
When Laker took 19 wickets, the remarkable thing really about that match was that Lock only got 1 wicket, and yet Lock bowled exactly the same stuff, only left-handed.
It's the intense rivalry which existed between Laker and Lock, and Lock was getting crosser and crosser because he couldn't get a wicket, and his reaction was to bowl quicker and quicker and quicker. And we all knew that if he'd only slow down, he had to get a wicket.
For the first time in 60 years, Australia had lost 3 consecutive Ashes campaigns.
Well, 56 was a horror year. It really was. For me, it was a horror year. I'd like to forget the whole thing, really.
Stand by for the opening night of the National Vision Service.
Hello there, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and children.
1956 may have been a bad year for Australian cricket, but it was also the year that television came to Australia and the Olympic Games came to Melbourne. 1956 also turned out to be a year of transition for Australian cricket. The retirement of senior players such as Lindsay Hassett, Arthur Morris, Bill Johnston, Gil Langley, Ian Johnson and Keith Miller opened the door for a new generation of young players and the need to select a new Test captain.
You had probably 2 leading candidates to captain Australia after the Johnson tour of 1950s. Benno and you have Harvey. Unfortunately, neither of them got on particularly well with either the captain or the manager of that tour, Bill Dowling.
I think you'd have to go back into the archives to see if Harvey and I got adverse reports from the 1956 captain when the meeting was held with the board, and I think you might find that had something to do with it.
In 1956, like all captains do, when they return to Australia after captaining their country overseas, they have to put in a report to the cricket board. And I'm firmly convinced that in that report that Ian Johnson put into the cricket board, he did not recommend either Richie Benaud or Neil Harvey as worthy people to captain Australia. And he recommended Ian as a man's job.
I'm a captain to accept the Mossman under-16 side and was quite content to be trying to consolidate my place in the Test team.
We all did our jobs on the field, that's what you've got to do. And certainly off the field we behaved ourselves. So I wouldn't see any reason why we should be degraded in any way to the cricket board. And I just cannot see why the report was put in like that.
The obvious choice was between Neil Harvey and Richie Benaud. Probably on past and experience, probably we were expecting Neil Harvey, Benaud a 40% chance. We did not expect Ian Craig to be captain.
Well, I don't think there was any question about New South Wales captaincy. I think it was assumed that Richie would get it. Neil would get the captaincy in Victoria and Ron Archer in Queensland, and it would be between those three, probably more between Richie and Neil. So it was certainly a nice select ahead of Richie in New South Wales.
New South Wales were playing Victoria at the Sydney Cricket Ground, and the morning before the game started, the captain for New Zealand, and Ian Craig was named, and I was named vice-captain. Admittedly, it didn't go down all that well with me at the time, but you've got to get on with life and you've got to make the most of what you have. But I backed Ian up to the hilt.
Attitude was one that, OK, I've been given a job to do and I've got to get on and do it, and there was no point in sort of considering what had gone on or why it had gone on.
Ian Craig was only 21 years old when he led his new-look Australian side on a 6-week tour of New Zealand in 1957. The average age of the side was 24, and for 8 of the 14-man squad, it was their first tour.
The older players who played during the war had all retired, so this was the opportunity to take a group of new young players, the Meckiffs, the Kleins, the Jarmans, giving them the opportunity, and Neil and Richie gave me tremendous support. They were the two of the major players who'd been in England the previous year and probably had the most justification to say, well, this has been unfair, but they were absolutely terrific, and I could never thank them enough.
He was always an older person, you know. You can never imagine Ian being 21. He never seemed to be 21. He handled things off the field brilliantly, great speaker, and you know, he played a major role in Australian cricket, which I don't think has been appreciated as much as it should be.
Ian Craig was reappointed as captain of Australia for the full tour of South Africa during the summer of 1957-58. The young Australian side faced the challenge of maintaining an unbeaten record in matches played in South Africa.
Australian cricket's got a tremendous record for invincibility. How do you fancy your chaps, your team, will be in keeping that tradition going?
Well, it's going to be very hard work, Charles, but I'm quite confident that we can do it. They've had some very great sides. Vic Richardson's side in 1935 and Lindsay Hassett's last tour. And possibly we're not as good a side as theirs. And I think the South Africans have probably improved a bit, but we'll be trying.
It was Craig who really was the lead of the resurgence. He was the one who captained that great team we had there, which developed in a great side, and a major role in that. It should be said, though, Richie and Harv and also Davo gave him enormous help.
The 1957-58 series in South Africa saw the rebirth of Australian cricket. The side included 4 players who would captain their country over the next 5 years. Ian Craig, Richie Benaud, Neil Harvey and Bobby Simpson. Making his Test debut was wicketkeeper Wally Grout, who would go on to be recognised as one of Australia's finest ever glovemen.
Ian Meckiff was the hero of Australia's attack.
Another debutant was a loose-limbed fast bowler from Victoria, Ian Meckiff.
Jackie McGlew and I opened against Meckiff in that Johannesburg Test. The first one I faced from him, I knew there was something peculiar. And in fact, I think I said to Jackie, you know, I think he chucked.
Lindsay Klein also made his debut in the series and distinguished himself by taking a hat-trick in the second test in Cape Town.
When Lindsay bowled those 3 fateful balls, I was at the other...
Trevor Goddard carried his bat for 56, yet the test had a highly dramatic finish. An hour of glory for Lindsay Klein, who had Tayfield LBW taking a wild swing. Poor old Huey was his second victim of succeeding balls, Fuller going the ball before. Could Klein make it 3 in a row?
I thought perhaps I think he might play back, and then on my approach I changed my mind and I bowled my wrong and I pitched right and hit the edge, and Simo took the great catch.
Here it is. Klein to Adcock. Simpson takes a slip catch and a jubilant Australian side pounces on Lindsay Klein, whose hat-trick clinched the victings and 141 runs.
I consider Bobby Simpson the best slip catcher I've ever seen, and there's been some great ones since. He gets my vote because he caught my 3rd wicket in the hat-trick.
Australia won the series convincingly. Of greater significance for Australian cricket was the emergence of Richie Benaud and Alan Davidson, who dominated the series with both bat and ball.
What you've got to remember, it was the first time Benaud and Davidson were away from the umbrella of the Lindwalls and the Millers and the senior players from the Bradman area. And that's when really both of them came of age as really magnificent Test cricketers.
This was the first time Davo and I had ever been given any position responsibility in the team. We'd played since 53 in the Australian side, but this was the first time Davo was the number 1 bowler at pace, and the first time I was the number 1 spinner.
Both batted well, we both fielded well, we both bowled well. Richie got 108 wickets, I think I got 72, and we probably got 2/3 or more of the wickets that were taken. It's the two of us, but the thing is we also scored 850 runs each on the tour.
Richie and Alan on that tour were like having 13 men in the side. They were both batting extremely well and bowling magnificently. Davo was able to swing the ball at times like I've never before, and Richie could bowl all day with great accuracy.
Warwick Grout batted 1, Benaud scampered home, and Australia yet to be beaten in South Africa.
Eight months later, England arrived at summer of 1958-59, having beaten Australia in the 3 previous Ashes series. Captained by Peter May, they boasted a formidable lineup. Batsmen like Cowdrey, spinners Laker and Locke, and fast bowlers Truman, Statham and Tyson.
We sent the best side that England's ever sent overseas in 58-59.
When the first newspaper stories arrived from Fleet Street, Brian Chapman, who's a very good mate, was the outstanding story. They all took the same view. Why are we bothering to go to Australia? Why don't we play something like pick the best team in the world to play England and we'll still thrash them?
Ian Craig caused the first censor when he stood down as Australian captain because of ill health.
6 weeks before the season started, I went down with hepatitis, and it wasn't a difficult decision. I guess my commitment then was to make sure Australia beat England in those Ashes, and if I was an impediment standing in the way of people getting on and doing that, it was better to. And so that's why I announced that I wouldn't play that season at all.
Suddenly Craig down with hepatitis at the same time that Neil Harvey goes on television in Melbourne and in an interview says that he can't get a decent job and he might have to think about moving interstate.
Well, if I'd have stayed in Victoria in 58, maybe I'd have a better chance to be captain.
He comes to New South Wales, who have already made me captain, knowing that Craig...
They got 2 nominees, I suppose you can call it, both from the one state, and only one's got to get it.
We had lunch together the day the announcement was made. I rang him up and said the news has just come through, Harv. I assume you got it. I said, yes, I have. And I said, let's go and have lunch at the Cricketers Club, which we did.
I'd probably be one of the best vice captains ever been. I've done it so often. I did for 5 years. But I backed everybody up. You got to. I mean, there's no sense spilt milk.
The coin spins in the air and Peter May calls. He calls tails. Richie Benaud leans down to pick up the coin and knows at the same time that he's lost the toss. May decides to bat.
Richie Benaud's first series as Australian captain coincided with the Australian Broadcasting Commission's first full television coverage of a home test series. Unfortunately, this first test is remembered for some painfully slow cricket.
It was one of the worst test matches I've ever played in, and I think most scribes would have said the same thing. It was one of the slowest days of all time. They were 6-day test matches in those days, which they 5 hours a day. But England in their second innings only 8 or something in a whole day's play.
The main culprit was Trevor Bailey, who laboured for 7.5 hours, scoring just 68 runs.
Barnacle, Bailey, the Boyle, as we used to call him too. We used to call him the Boyle. They were infectious too. But I can only say that the Boyle was one competitor. He really was. He gave you any batted.
I certainly played my cricket seriously. I didn't give anything away. And that's how I expected other people. And certainly all the Australians I played against, they played it hard.
A typical defensive stroke from Bailey. The scoring rate is so slow as to be almost imperceptible.
He provoked the crowd tremendously, you know. I mean, they used to hate him, like with cries of, "Bailey, I wish you were a statue and I was a pigeon," and things like that, you know.
Australia won the first test in Brisbane in spite of Trevor Bailey. And after Ian threw the England batting lineup to take 6 for 38 and secure an Australian victory in the second test in Melbourne, doubts began to surface about the legality of his action.
When I took the 6 in the second innings, that's when the Johnny Wardle piece came out in the paper the next day, and that's when the whole thing really took off. Because all of a sudden, all the English press got in on the bandwagon as well.
Godfrey, other than 1 or 2 more, walked around the ground to get different angles. This fella, Mickey's bowling, you see. And they came back, and the consensus of opinion was, yes, the action was very suspect.
Losing the line of the arm and everything else, and the ball going across, mostly across.
But to know him very well, I said, Dodd Bradman will turn around and say, well, put your own house in order before you start talking about mine.
The snag was, of course, we got Tony Locke, and I mean, he was throwing away. I did feel that every side we faced around the country, apart from Queensland, had someone with an action which wasn't, in my opinion, entirely legitimate.
England came out here with one of the best teams that they've ever fielded and were very soundly beaten. The English press were looking for escape, and I was one of them.
In addition to concerns over the action of Ian Meckiff, there was also spinners Keith Slater and Jimmy Burke, and fast bowler Gordon Rourke, who, in addition to his action, had a pronounced drag in his deliveries that posed additional problems for the England batsmen.
Rourke was the danger. He had the longest drag I've ever seen in my life. His front foot pitched about 6 feet beyond the popping crease. He'd pull himself up to his full height and throw it at you. And Colin Cowdrey said, don't play forward to him, he might tread on you.
The debate over the legality of bowling actions was a sore that would continue to fester well into the next decade. In spite of the controversy, Australia won the series by an emphatic 4-0 margin and regained the Ashes for the first time in 6 years. The result was a triumph for Richie Benaud in his first series as Australian captain.
All the players in 58-9 under Richie Benaud all played for the captain. And this is why this team got developed into a pretty good, because of team spirit that was by the captain into this team.
For the much-travelled Australian team, it's another departure, this time to lands of strange customs where the cricketing habits are a mystery to many of the players.
In the summer of 1959-60, Australia embarked on the first full test tour of India and Pakistan. An arduous 3-month assignment that included 3 tests in Pakistan and in India. Australia had made a brief visit to the subcontinent on the way home from in 1956 and lost the test match against Pakistan in Karachi that was played on a matting wicket.
We hadn't played on Koya matting since we were at school. And to be faced with this phenomenon to play a test match on a Koya mat, which we hadn't seen before, was quite out of this world. And then you confronted one of the best seam bowlers that Pakistan's ever produced, a bloke called Fazal Mahmood. And on the Koya mat, he was not.
Prior to leaving for Pakistan in 1959, the Australians practicing wickets in preparation for the test in Karachi, a match that was witnessed by US President Dwight Eisenhower.
We sat Sam Loxton, President Eisenhower, Field Marshal Ayub Khan, Sam to President Eisenhower. Of course, he said, we're playing on matting out there. That may not mean much to you, Mr. President, but it is an insult to the rest of the cricket community that a team is asked to come to Pakistan and be on the mat. And he turned, Eisenhower turned to Ayub Khan and said, do they not play on grass if it's an insult? And Ayub Khan said, this will be, I promise you, the last match ever played on matting in Pakistan.
After winning the series in Pakistan 2-0, Australia journeyed to India. In the second test in Kanpur, the Australians were confronted with a mystery spinner by the name of Jasu Patel, who ended up taking 14 wickets in the match.
The pitch didn't have a blade of grass on it, and they had a bloke called Patel. He used to bowl these fast off-spinners, and they used to turn about 3 feet.
India's victory at Kanpur was its first test win over Australia, and there was much celebration and rejoicing among the locals. Australia hoped with the variable conditions to win the series. However, it was more the off-field conditions and the bouts of serious illness suffered by many of the players that was cause for much concern.
Gordon Rook, Lindsay Klein and Gavin Stevens all got titus.
And I think it's true to say that his wife didn't wreck off the aeroplane. He had a variety of things like hepatitis, very bad bout of hepatitis, colitis, and 3 or 4 other things as well. We had to fly him back early.
Gavin Stevens, I don't think he played first-class cricket again. Lindsay took about 3 or 4 months before he really recovered from it.
I had come home from India and Pakistan ill, and I spent 3 months away from work recovering from hepatitis.
By the end of the 1950s, Australia had, for the first time, travelled to every corner of the cricketing world and played official matches against all countries. The decade had also witnessed the transition from the end of the Bradman era to the beginning of the Benno era.
We beat New Zealand, then we went across and we thrashed South Africa. Then we come back and we beat England. Now we go to India and Pakistan, we've beaten them. That was quite an achievement, but still looming around there and playing.
Towards the brilliance of Garfield Sobers.
At the moment, I'm with the Australian cricket team in South Africa, and they'd all like to send some Christmas messages home.
I'd also like to send a Merry Christmas to my mother and father and all members of my family.
I'd like to send my love to Stella, and Stella look after them.
I'd send a cheerio to mother and father, brother and sister, and my fiancée Lorraine.
I would like to send Christmas greetings to my wife Lois. How are you, Lois? And also to all my friends in Melbourne.
I'd like to send Christmas greetings to my wife and 2 little boys, and also, darling, that everything is all right up there on the farm.
I'd like to send my Christmas greetings, best wishes to my fiancée Meg, my mother and father, and Meg's mother.
It's nothing unusual for us to be away for Christmas. New South Wales members and Bobby as well also have been away for quite some time.
Hello as well.